A black veteran walks into a store, but instead of respect, he's met with humiliation. A manager tries to throw him out like he's nothing, not knowing that Big Shaq is watching. What starts as one act of injustice turns into a nationwide reckoning. A stolen legacy, a buried war hero, a corrupt system desperate to stay hidden. But when Big Shaq steps in, the truth won't stay buried. Because this time, the whole world is watching. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the city, reflecting off the polished glass storefronts and sleek black cars lining the curb. Inside Whitaker's Market, the air smelled of roasted coffee, fresh produce, and overpriced luxury goods. The kind of store where a loaf of bread cost $5 just because it came in artisan packaging. At first glance, Shaquille O'Neal was just another shopper, towering, broad-shouldered, moving slow as he browsed the aisles. Dressed in a fitted hoodie, joggers, and sneakers, he was low-key, no entourage, no cameras. He had done this a million times before, slipped into regular life like a giant among men, unseen but somehow still noticed. A few people glanced his way, whispering, recognizing him, but no one approached. That was the unspoken rule in a place like this, politeness wrapped in privilege. He reached for a carton of almond milk when the door's electronic chime went off. Leonard "Lenny" Carter walked in. The man wasn't flashy, he wasn't famous, but he carried himself like someone who had been through hell and survived it. His military cap was old, slightly frayed at the edges, with a patch that read, "Vietnam Veteran." His jacket, an old army green field coat, had seen better days. His jeans were faded, boots scuffed, but his posture, straight, solid, undeniable. Shaq noticed him immediately. Something about the way Lenny walked, measured and precise, not a single wasted step. A soldier's discipline never really left, no matter how much time passed. From behind the checkout counter, Bradley Whitaker narrowed his eyes. Bradley was the store's general manager, a man in his mid-40s with slicked-back blonde hair, a permanently smug expression, and the kind of self-importance that came with inherited wealth. His father had been a corporate big shot. Bradley had inherited that air of entitlement, but none of the talent. He wasn't the owner, just a man with too much power in a place too small for his ego. He elbowed one of his junior employees, nodding toward Lenny. "Keep an eye on that one. He looks like trouble." Shaq, still pretending to browse, heard every word. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react. Not yet. Lenny moved through the store with quiet efficiency. He wasn't lingering, wasn't loitering. He was just shopping. He picked up a single bottle of water, then a protein bar, and headed toward the checkout line. A quick in-and-out trip, but Bradley wasn't having it. The manager stepped out from behind the counter, cutting Lenny off before he could even reach the register. The whole store seemed to pause. "Can I help you?" Bradley's voice was all fake politeness, stretched thin over something uglier. Lenny, unfazed, met his gaze. "No, I'm good. Just grabbing these." "Uh-huh." Bradley crossed his arms. "You sure about that?" A beat of silence. Customers shuffled awkwardly in the background, pretending not to watch, but watching all the same. Lenny arched a brow, his voice steady. "Did I do something wrong?" "Depends." Bradley glanced at the bottle in Lenny's hand. "You planning to pay for that?" The insult hung in the air like a slap. Shaq stilled, fingers tightening around the grocery basket in his hand. Lenny's expression didn't change. He was used to this. Too used to it. That was the worst part. "I have money," Lenny said simply. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet. Bradley barely glanced at it. He smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, I've seen guys like you before. Always got some sob story. Always looking for a handout." Shaq's grip on the basket tightened just a little more. Lenny sighed, shaking his head. "Look, son, I don't know what your problem is, but I just came in to buy a damn bottle of water. That's it." "Sure you did," Bradley scoffed. Then he turned to one of the security guards posted near the entrance. "Go ahead and escort him out." That's when Shaq finally moved. Slow, purposeful, unmistakable. At 7 feet, 1 inch, 325 pounds. He wasn't just big. He was gravity itself, shifting the energy in the room with nothing but presence. He stepped forward, closing the gap between them with measured steps, his voice calm, but deep enough to make the air seem heavier. "You really want to do this?" Bradley turned, startled. His mouth opened, then closed. His brain was catching up to the fact that he had just stepped into a different league. "Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize you were..." Shaq ignored him, looking straight at Lenny. "You good, sir?" His tone was soft but direct. Lenny exhaled through his nose, then nodded once. Shaq turned back to Bradley. "You sure you want to be that guy right now?" Bradley swallowed hard, glancing around the store. People were recording now, phones raised. The tension was thick enough to cut. He stammered, trying to regain control. "It's not what it looks like." Shaq just stared, unblinking, unmoving. Bradley squirmed under the weight of it. Silence stretched. Then Bradley made the biggest mistake of all. "This has nothing to do with race." A sharp exhale escaped from Lenny's nose, a humorless laugh. Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying Bradley the way a lion studies prey. "You sure about that?" Bradley's confidence cracked, his face turning red. "I was just following policy." "Nah." Shaq cut him off. "You were following your own damn prejudice, and now the whole world's gonna see it." Bradley's jaw clenched. His gaze darted to the phone's recording, then back to Shaq. His mind was racing, calculating. But there was no way out of this. After a long pause, he stepped back. "Fine," he muttered. "He can pay for his stuff and leave." Shaq didn't move right away. He let the moment sit, let it marinate, let the weight of Bradley's failure settle into the air like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Then, finally, he nodded. Lenny walked up to the counter, deliberate and unshaken, and placed his bottle of water and protein bar down. The cashier, who had been frozen in awkward silence the whole time, rang him up without a word. Shaq pulled out his own wallet and slid a $100 bill onto the counter. "Keep the change," he said. Lenny took his bag, nodded to Shaq in quiet gratitude, then turned and walked out of the store, his dignity fully intact. The door's chime rang again as he left. Shaq, still standing there, gave Bradley one last look. A simple, measured glance that said everything without saying a word. Then, he too walked out. The second he was gone, the floodgates opened. Customers whispered, employees exchanged glances, and the store's entire mood had shifted. Someone muttered, "Damn, that was embarrassing." And from the corner, a teenage cashier slowly lifted his phone, stopping the recording and posting it online with a caption that would set the internet on fire. "Manager tries to throw out black veteran. Has no idea Shaq is watching." The store hummed with the quiet murmur of shoppers, the occasional beep of a barcode scanner, and the rhythmic tapping of polished shoes on tile floors. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through the glass windows, casting long shadows on the aisles. Lenny Carter had always been a man who took up little space, though his presence carried weight. His movements were intentional, economical, like someone who had spent a lifetime being aware of how others perceived him. He wasn't in a rush, but he wasn't dawdling either, just picking up what he needed: a single bottle of water, a protein bar. He turned toward the checkout lanes, slipping into line behind a young woman fumbling with her designer purse, looking for her platinum card. Lenny waited patiently, staring ahead, his military cap casting a shadow over his face. That's when he felt it. The weight of a gaze. Bradley Whitaker. From his self-appointed perch near the customer service desk, Bradley had already decided Lenny didn't belong. It wasn't the first time he'd done this. It wasn't even the first time today. But this one felt different. Maybe it was the way Lenny stood, proud despite his worn-out clothes. Maybe it was the fact that this man had walked into his store and moved with a quiet dignity that Bradley would never understand. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because someone like Lenny wasn't supposed to exist in a place like this. Bradley stepped forward. "Hey," he called out, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "What exactly are you doing?" Lenny glanced up, confusion flickering across his face. "Buying water." Bradley folded his arms across his chest, a smug smile creeping onto his lips. Looked like you were lingering. Lenny held up the bottle. You think I'm stealing $1's worth of water? I didn't say that. Bradley's eyes flickered to the security guard stationed near the entrance. Just looked suspicious, that's all. Shoppers slowed their movements, ears perking. The tension, thin but undeniable, stretched through the air. Lenny exhaled sharply. Son, I fought for this country. I've been shot at, bled, and watched brothers die beside me. He shook his head. And you're standing here acting like I'm trying to walk out of here with a damn protein bar. Bradley smirked, leaning in just slightly. Yeah? And look where it got you. A slow murmur rippled through the store. Some shoppers exchanged glances but said nothing. No one stepped in. Lenny's jaw clenched. He had seen this game before. He had lived it. A woman in a navy blazer turned away, pretending to check the nutrition label on a box of cereal. A man in a suit gave a nervous glance toward the security guard before deciding he wanted no part of this. The worst part? Lenny didn't even look surprised. Bradley took another step, now deliberately closing the space between them. We have a policy about... Let him pay, a deep voice cut through the air. The whole store froze. Shaquille O'Neal hadn't moved much since the moment this began. He had been watching, not interfering, not yet. But now his voice, low, calm, and absolute, rolled through the store like distant thunder. Bradley hesitated, his face twitching into something almost defensive before recovering. Mr. O'Neal, sir, this isn't... Shaq raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply let the moment stretch long enough for the weight of Bradley's own words to settle on his shoulders. Lenny turned his head slightly toward Shaq, his expression unreadable. He had been in enough battles to recognize a shift in momentum. Bradley took a breath, recalculating. He could feel the phone cameras aimed at him now. He glanced at the security guard again, wordlessly demanding backup. The guard hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Sir, the security officer said, his tone careful but firm. I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. Lenny let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You're serious? Bradley crossed his arms, regaining a bit of his confidence. He had control again. This was his store, his authority, and it didn't matter how many eyes were on them. You heard him, Bradley said, a smirk tugging at his lips. You can take your little speech and... A single movement stopped him cold. Shaq placed his grocery basket down. Slowly. Deliberately. Then he turned, fully facing Bradley now. The energy in the store shifted. Bradley wasn't a small man, but compared to Shaq, he looked like a kid who had just realized he'd picked a fight he couldn't win. Shaq's eyes didn't narrow. His lips didn't purse. There was no dramatic anger, no unnecessary theatrics. Just disappointment. You really want to do this? Shaq asked. His voice wasn't threatening, but it carried weight. Bradley swallowed, and yet, he doubled down. This is store policy, he said, standing a little taller now that the eyes of the store were on him. We have every right to refuse service. No, Shaq interrupted. You have the right to be decent. That shut him up. Lenny adjusted his cap. I'll leave, he muttered. No, Shaq said again, but softer this time. You'll buy your water, and you'll walk out of here with dignity. Bradley's face flushed red. The store was silent now. The security guard, who had started this interaction as Bradley's backup, shifted uncomfortably, realizing he had chosen the wrong side. And that's when Shaq did something that would haunt Bradley far more than 1,000 angry tweets ever could. He smiled. A slow, knowing, measured smile. Bradley's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He wasn't afraid of Shaq, not in a physical sense. But he was afraid of what this meant. The weight of his actions was no longer invisible. Bradley licked his lips, forcing a chuckle. Look, this has gotten out of hand. Sir, you can buy your things and... Shaq tilted his head. Oh, now it's fine? Bradley had no answer. Lenny turned toward the cashier, setting the bottle of water and protein bar on the counter. Shaq reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it down without a word. Lenny hesitated before picking it up. There was no grand moment of gratitude, no dramatic handshake. Just a quiet understanding between men who had lived through different battles, but understood the war just the same. The cashier rang him up. The receipt printed. Lenny took his bag, nodded once, and turned for the door. And not a single person stopped him this time. Shaq waited a beat longer. He let his gaze rest on Bradley for just a few seconds more, long enough to burn this moment into memory, then turned and walked out, his long stride effortlessly catching up to Lenny as they stepped into the sunlit sidewalk. The store exhaled, conversations restarted. And inside, Bradley stood, fists clenched, watching as a teenage cashier quietly uploaded the footage to Twitter. The video would go viral within the hour. Bradley just didn't know it yet. For a moment, everything hung in the air. Lenny Carter stood near the exit, his fingers clenching the plastic bag holding nothing but a bottle of water and a protein bar. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid, but he wasn't trembling. He never did. The security guard beside him waited for the final cue, eyes flicking toward Bradley Whitaker, who stood smug and self-satisfied, arms crossed over his chest, looking at Lenny like he was trash that had been taken to the curb. That's when Shaquille O'Neal moved. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud. He didn't need volume. "You really want to do this?" A single sentence, low and firm, but it carried the gravity of an earthquake. The store, which had been alive with murmurs and whispers just moments ago, fell into a vacuum of silence. The kind of silence that didn't just happen. It was forced into place by the sheer weight of presence. People turned. And that's when they recognized him. The slow realization crawled across Bradley's face. His confidence faltered, just for a second, like a man stepping onto weak ice. "Mr. O'Neal," he started, his voice awkward, forced into politeness. I didn't realize you were..." Shaq lifted a hand, the slightest movement, and it was enough to shut him up. Then, Shaq turned his head, just enough to meet Lenny's gaze. It was a small moment, a quiet moment, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "Sir, you good?" Lenny exhaled, short and controlled, but Shaq caught the flicker of emotion beneath it. The exhaustion, the history, the understanding that this wasn't the first time. Lenny nodded, but Shaq knew that nod. That was a man who had been nodding his way through injustice his whole damn life. Shaq inhaled deeply, rolling his shoulders back before turning back to Bradley, his expression unreadable. "I'll cover his tab," he said simply. But then, he took a step forward, his voice dropping just slightly, enough to make the air feel heavier. "Actually," he turned, looking at the other customers. "Who here thinks this man deserves an apology?" The weight of the question settled over the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably. A woman in a floral dress looked down at her cart, suddenly very interested in a box of crackers. An older man, probably in his 60s, cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. A teenager holding his phone, who had been recording the whole thing, hesitated, glancing around to see who else was going to speak first. No one did. Because this is how it always went, wasn't it? People saw the injustice. They felt it. And yet, they waited for someone else to step in. Bradley, sensing the moment slipping out of his control, doubled down. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and forced out a laugh, though it was thin and nervous. "This isn't about race, Mr. O'Neal," he said, his voice falsely casual. "It's about policy." Shaq's eyes flickered. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like." The smirk on Bradley's face died instantly. Shaq let the words hang in the air for a second, before turning his gaze toward the security guard. A man in his late 30s, built broad but carrying the uncertain stiffness of someone who realized he was on the wrong side of a situation. His arms were crossed, but his fingers twitched slightly against his biceps. A small betrayal of nerves. "You really gonna drag this man out over a bottle of water?" Shaq asked him directly. The security guard hesitated. He glanced at Bradley, waiting for instruction. That hesitation was everything. Because now, people were watching. And Bradley, for the first time in a long time, wasn't the one in control. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. His power, his authority, was slipping through his hands like sand. Shaq watched him, studied him, waited. And then, finally, Bradley cracked. His shoulders fell just slightly, and in a voice that lacked every ounce of the smug confidence he had before, he muttered, "Fine." The word wasn't loud, but it was defeat. Lenny exhaled slowly, but not in relief, because this wasn't a victory. It was just another reminder of the battles he had to fight every damn day. Shaq glanced at him, saw the way Lenny carried himself, despite it all. And then, Shaq made sure this wouldn't just disappear. He turned back to Bradley. "Say it." Bradley blinked. "Say what?" "You know what." The words were calm, measured, but undeniable. Bradley's throat bobbed, his fingers twitched at his sides. But he wasn't getting out of this, because now the phones were recording. The murmurs grew louder, people were waiting. Bradley clenched his teeth, but eventually, in a quiet, forced voice, he muttered, "I'm sorry." It sounded like glass breaking in his throat. Shaq just stared. No satisfaction, no smirk. Just a quiet, weighted silence. Then he turned to Lenny. "You ready to go, sir?" Lenny nodded again. But this time, it wasn't the same nod. This time, it was his choice. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out a $100 bill, and placed it on the counter without a word. The cashier, who had been frozen this entire time, fumbled to take it, nodding rapidly. Lenny took his bag, and together they walked out. The store exhaled the moment they left, and inside, Bradley stood in his own silence. A cashier leaned to whisper something to a coworker. The older man in the suit adjusted his tie again, looking away. The teenager with his phone glanced down at his screen, his fingers hovering over the upload button. Bradley felt it in his bones. This moment wasn't going to stay inside this store. It was about to go far, far beyond it. But something had happened. Lenny Carter adjusted the plastic bag in his hand, exhaling through his nose. His face was unreadable, but Shaq recognized that look. It wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in a man's bones after a lifetime of being tested. Shaq didn't say anything at first. He just walked alongside Lenny down the sidewalk, past the neatly parked cars and the pedestrians who gave them quick, curious glances. Behind them, back in Whitaker's Market, a teenager stood frozen near the self-checkout lanes, phone in hand. His thumb hovered over the screen for a brief second before he tapped it. Upload. And just like that, the world changed. The first few views trickled in slow, almost unnoticed. A couple dozen likes, a handful of comments, a repost here, a repost there. Then, someone big picked it up, a journalist, a celebrity, maybe even an activist, someone with reach. And within the next 2 hours, it was everywhere. The video wasn't overly dramatic. There was no shaky camera work, no exaggerated edits. Just a simple recording of a black veteran being humiliated and a 7'1" giant stepping in to shift the entire room. And it hit a nerve. On Twitter, the arguments ignited like gasoline to a match. Justice for Lenny started trending first, fueled by rage, disbelief, and a painful recognition of a story that wasn't new. Then came the other side. Rules are rules. A counter-argument filled with people insisting that race had nothing to do with it, and that stores have the right to refuse service. The division was instant, predictable, infuriating, relentless. Thousands of comments flooded in. I swear I've seen this same scenario play out 1,000,000 times. But this time, they messed with the wrong one. Shaq didn't even raise his voice. That's power. "I'm sorry, but where in the video does it show racism?" The manager was following protocol. The fact that Lenny just stood there, calm, as if he's used to this, that's what broke me. The debates were endless. On Facebook, news outlets latched on. They replayed the video, froze frames, analyzed Shaq's stance, broke down every single word that was exchanged. CNN, FOX, MSNBC, blogs, podcasts, everyone had an opinion. But the most important voice? Lenny's was still missing. The next morning, Lenny sat at his small kitchen table, staring at his ancient flip phone like it was a grenade. It hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters, old friends, strangers. People wanted his reaction. They wanted his story. And he wasn't sure he wanted to give it. A knock at the door made him flinch. He knew who it was before he even opened it. Shaq stood there, massive and unbothered, holding 2 cups of coffee like they were thimbles in his hands. "Figured you could use one," Shaq said, handing it over. Lenny took it, shaking his head. "You trying to turn me into a celebrity?" Shaq leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask for all this, huh?" Lenny huffed out a humorless laugh. "Hell no." Shaq nodded slowly. Then, his voice dropped to something softer. Something firm. "Maybe not. But you deserve it." Lenny held his gaze for a moment before exhaling, rubbing a hand down his face. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head again. "I just wanted some damn water." Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, and Bradley wanted to flex his little power trip in front of an audience. Now the whole country's watching." Lenny took a sip of the coffee, then winced. "This is terrible." Shaq smirked. "I know, but it wakes you up." Lenny sighed, staring down at the steaming cup in his hands. "You think it'll matter?" he asked after a long pause. Shaq tilted his head. "What?" "All this?" Lenny gestured vaguely. "The hashtags, the news, the outrage." He shrugged. "It'll fade, won't it?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He let the question sit. Because truthfully? Lenny wasn't wrong. But then Shaq said, "Not this time." Lenny looked up, skeptical. "And why's that?" Shaq sipped his own coffee before responding. "Because now it's not just your story. It's everyone's." Lenny let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure if that made him feel better. Or worse. As the hours ticked by, the internet only grew louder. Memes flooded social media, some praising Shaq, some mocking Bradley, some turning the entire thing into a late-night punchline. Political commentators weighed in, turning the conversation into a debate about power, privilege, and race. A former soldier tweeted, "Lenny Carter didn't just fight for this country. He got discarded by it. And the fact that we're even arguing about this proves it." Meanwhile, corporate America scrambled. Whitaker's Market released a statement, all polished PR language and damage control, claiming they were investigating the incident. But the public wasn't buying it. The store's Google reviews tanked overnight. 1-star ratings flooded in. People called for boycotts. And Bradley? Bradley disappeared. His social media accounts vanished. His LinkedIn went private. But it was too late. Because the internet had already found everything. Old tweets resurfaced. Past complaints from employees leaked. Former customers came forward, claiming this wasn't Bradley's first time singling someone out. And just like that, his downfall wasn't just coming. It had already started. By nightfall, the clip of Shaq standing firm in that grocery store had racked up millions of views. Some people called it the moment America needed. Others said it was just another reminder of how bad things still were. Lenny Carter? He wasn't sure what to call it. But as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the hundreds of messages flooding in, he realized something. Whether he liked it or not, he wasn't invisible anymore. And this was just the beginning. The news cycle had not slowed. If anything, it had picked up more speed, more fire, more controversy. By now, everyone knew the story. A black veteran humiliated in a grocery store. A manager who picked the wrong fight. A legend who stepped in and made the whole country watch. But what the world didn't know, what no one had even thought to ask, was who Lenny Carter really was. And that was about to change. The article started like any other piece of social commentary. A freelance journalist named Calvin Roswell had been following the viral moment like everyone else. At first, he assumed it would fade into the endless stream of internet outrage. Another story lost to the algorithm. But something about Lenny caught his eye. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Maybe it was how he had stood there, calm, controlled, like a man who had seen far worse and survived it. Something felt unfinished. So Calvin did what journalists do best. He dug deeper. At first, the search was frustrating. Lenny Carter was a veteran. That much was easy to find. But his records were thin. Too thin. Most veterans, even those who served decades ago, had a paper trail. Medals, awards, missions logged in government archives. But Lenny? It was like someone had erased half his story. Calvin wasn't the type to stop when things didn't add up. He made calls. He searched through military databases, public records, old newspaper clippings. And then, he found it. Buried in a classified military report from 1974, there was a name that shouldn't have been there. Captain Leonard Carter. Not private, not sergeant, not some low-ranking foot soldier forgotten by time. Captain. Calvin's breath caught in his throat. Lenny Carter hadn't just served, he had led. But why wasn't this public record? The further Calvin dug, the darker the truth became. Lenny had been part of a highly classified rescue mission in Vietnam. His team was sent deep behind enemy lines to extract American POWs. The mission had gone horribly wrong. Half the squad was killed. The survivors had no backup, no air support. And yet somehow Lenny had gotten them out. 6 men. He had saved 6 American soldiers from certain death. And then, someone else took the credit. A white officer, Lieutenant Charles Merritt, who had been wounded early in the mission and had done nothing but lie bleeding in a bunker while Lenny did the impossible. When the soldiers were finally rescued, Merritt, from the comfort of a hospital bed, was awarded the Silver Star. Lenny's name? Nowhere in the official reports. Because in 1974, in the United States military, a black man wasn't going to be the face of heroism. And the truth? It had been buried ever since. It took less than 12 hours for Calvin's article to spread. Shaq was at home, sitting in his oversized leather chair, scrolling through the latest headlines on his phone when his inbox pinged. A text from an old friend in the media industry. "Bro, you need to read this." Shaq clicked the link. And for the next 10 minutes, he didn't move. Every word sank deeper. Every detail was worse than the last. Lenny hadn't just been humiliated in a grocery store. He had been erased. And now the world was about to see him. Shaq let out a slow breath, fingers gripping the phone tighter. This wasn't just about one racist store manager anymore. This was bigger. Much, much bigger. And Shaq? He wasn't about to let this stay buried. The first wave of outrage had been about the grocery store, about an old veteran being disrespected in plain sight. But now it was something else entirely. This wasn't just about racism in retail. This was the U.S. military. A national disgrace, a hero erased. And people were furious. A man saved 6 lives and they erased him? Not just erased, they gave his medal to someone else. I want to hear Charles Merritt explain this. Where is he now? How many other black soldiers got robbed of their legacy? And then, someone found the receipts. A military historian dug up the original 1974 photograph of the rescued soldiers. 6 men, standing together, wrapped in bloodied bandages, exhausted but alive. And at the center of the image? Lenny Carter. Not in the background, not just a part of the team. The leader. The man who had gotten them out alive. Yet in every official government account of the mission, Lenny was simply listed as a participant. The erasure was complete. Calculated, absolute, but not anymore. The next morning, Shaq pulled up outside Lenny's small apartment, stepping out of his car and knocking on the door. Lenny answered with tired eyes and a tight jaw. "I saw the article," Shaq said. Lenny exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his face. "Yeah." Shaq studied him. "You knew, didn't you?" Lenny didn't answer right away. He walked back inside, letting Shaq step in behind him. The place was small, simple, but filled with fragments of a life no one had ever truly acknowledged. Old military medals that didn't tell the full story. Faded newspaper clippings about missions that barely mentioned his name. A history that had been rewritten without him. Lenny finally spoke. "I knew," he admitted. "But I learned a long time ago. Raising hell about it wasn't going to change a damn thing." Shaq leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You think it's too late now?" Lenny met his gaze. "Isn't it?" Shaq shook his head. "Not this time." Lenny huffed out a bitter laugh. "You really think an article and some Twitter hashtags are going to fix this?" "No," Shaq said, voice steady. "But it's a start." Lenny was quiet. Because the truth was, he didn't know if he wanted this fight. He had spent decades surviving, and now the world was asking him to relive it all. Shaq saw the hesitation in his eyes. He understood it, but he also knew this story wasn't going away. "You don't have to do anything," Shaq said. "But people are talking, Lenny, and they're not going to stop." Lenny let out a slow breath, staring at the floor. Shaq placed a hand on his shoulder, firm but reassuring. "Just think about it." Then he turned and walked out, leaving Lenny with nothing but silence and a decision to make. By nightfall, Lenny Carter's name was everywhere. News anchors debated his story. Veterans demanded answers. The military's press office released a stiff, vague statement about reviewing historical records. And in the middle of it all, sitting in his small apartment, staring at his old medals, was the man himself, wondering if this time, for the first time, history would finally get it right. Shaq wasn't a man who hesitated. Not on the court. Not in life. And this was bigger than Lenny Carter's humiliation in a grocery store. Bigger than a viral moment. Bigger than one racist manager. This was a stolen legacy. A buried truth. A wrong that had been left to rot for decades. And Shaq had no intention of letting it stay that way. Shaq didn't waste time. He knew that the internet's outrage had a short shelf life. If they didn't act now, the story would fade into the abyss of forgotten headlines. So he picked up his phone and started calling the right people. First, he called a lawyer, Maggie Rollins, a civil rights attorney known for dragging corrupt institutions into the light. She had taken on wrongful convictions, police brutality cases, corporate discrimination lawsuits. And now? Now she was going to take on the U.S. military. "This is big," she said, after Shaq laid everything out for her. "You're talking about decades-old corruption, missing records, a war hero who was erased. The government's going to fight this." "I know," Shaq said. "That's why I need someone who won't back down." Maggie exhaled. "Then you got the right person." Next, he called a journalist, Elliot Burns, a relentless investigative reporter known for exposing corporate greed and government cover-ups. He had worked on Pulitzer Prize-winning stories, peeled back the layers of America's ugliest scandals. And when Shaq sent him the article about Lenny, Elliot's response was immediate. "Tell him to sit tight," Elliot said, "because we're about to make some very powerful people very uncomfortable." Finally, Shaq called a veteran, General Raymond Tate, a retired four-star general with enough weight in the military community to make people listen. He had served for nearly 40 years, fought in multiple wars, and had zero tolerance for injustice. When Shaq told him about Lenny, there was a long silence. Then, General Tate's voice came through, cold and sharp. "I'll make some calls." That was all he said. That was all he needed to say. Meanwhile, in the middle of all this, Bradley Whitaker was drowning. Corporate had already thrown him under the bus. The second the video went viral, the company panicked. Their social media team released a carefully worded statement about commitment to inclusivity and zero tolerance for discrimination. And Bradley? Bradley became the sacrificial lamb. His boss called him into the office, face tight, voice clipped. "We're letting you go." Bradley's jaw clenched. "You're firing me?" His boss didn't even blink. "You embarrassed the brand. You think we can afford this kind of PR disaster?" Bradley's face turned red. "I was following protocol." "You were making an ass of yourself on camera," his boss snapped. "And now you're trending for all the wrong reasons." Bradley's fingers curled into fists. Everything was crumbling. But he wasn't about to go down quietly. So he did what every entitled man who ever got caught in his own mess did. He played the victim. The very next day, Bradley sued the company for wrongful termination. His argument? He was being unfairly targeted by woke culture. "They fired me for doing my job," he said in a televised interview. "They threw me under the bus to appease the mob." And just like that, the media shifted. At first, Lenny was the hero, the veteran wronged by the system. But now, conservative news outlets started painting Bradley as the real victim. This is what cancel culture looks like. A hardworking store manager loses his job just because social media said so? First, they come for your history. Now, they come for your jobs. It didn't matter that Bradley had humiliated a veteran. It didn't matter that Lenny had lost decades of recognition. What mattered, to the people who needed a reason to dismiss the truth, was that Bradley was white, and he had been punished for it. The internet turned into a battlefield. On one side, people demanding justice for Lenny. On the other, people screaming about political correctness, going too far. And in the middle of it all, Shaq, watching, waiting, preparing for the next move. Because if Bradley wanted to make this a fight, Shaq was about to make sure he lost. Lenny never wanted the spotlight, but now, he was in the center of a firestorm. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. News stations wanted interviews. Strangers online were either calling him a hero or calling him a fraud. And then, the threats started. Emails, messages, calls from blocked numbers. Stop running your mouth. You're ruining a good man's life over nothing. Maybe you should have stayed invisible. Lenny read the messages in silence. Then, without a word, he turned off his phone. Shaq knew they had to act fast. Bradley's lawsuit had shifted the conversation. What should have been about Lenny's stolen honor was now about a white man losing his job. And Shaq wasn't about to let that happen. So he did what no one expected. He called a press conference. He didn't tell Lenny. Not yet. Because he knew the man well enough to know Lenny wasn't ready to face the world. Not yet. So Shaq stood in front of dozens of cameras, dozens of microphones, and millions of eyes watching from home. And he said 3 words that shattered the narrative. Let's talk facts. The crowd fell silent. And Shaq did what he did best. He spoke, not in sound bites, not in hashtags, but in truth. By the time Shaq walked off that stage, the internet wasn't talking about Bradley Whitaker anymore. They were talking about the war hero who had been erased, and now it was time to bring the truth all the way to the surface. Because Lenny Carter's story wasn't finished yet, and neither was Shaq. Bradley Whitaker should have been done, fired, exposed, mocked across the internet. By all logic, his career should have been over. He should have slunk away like so many before him, becoming just another forgotten face in the long history of public disgrace. But he wasn't backing down, and that's what made Shaq suspicious. Shaq had seen men like Bradley before, small men in big positions, people who folded the second they were exposed. But Bradley? He wasn't retreating. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't even trying to disappear. Instead, he was fighting harder. His lawsuit against Whitaker's market was gaining traction. Conservative news outlets were platforming him like a martyr. And somehow, against all logic, he still had lawyers backing him. Good lawyers. Expensive lawyers. The kind of legal team that a middle management grocery store manager shouldn't be able to afford. Someone was funding him. Someone wanted this fight to continue. Shaq could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just Bradley Whitaker clawing for his reputation. This was something else. Shaq made a call. Not to a lawyer. Not to a journalist. This time, he called an investigator. Jonathan J.T. Calloway. A private investigator known for digging up dirt that wasn't supposed to be found. Shaq kept the conversation simple. I need to know who's behind Bradley. JT didn't hesitate. I'll get back to you. And when he did, what he found changed everything. Bradley wasn't just some disgruntled ex-manager. He had connections. Ties to a well-funded, well-organized political group. A group with a long, ugly history of covering up racial scandals, protecting men like Bradley, and shifting blame onto the victims. They weren't just supporting him. They were using him. Bradley's lawsuit? It was never about winning. It was about changing the narrative. Turning Lenny from the victim to the villain. Turning this entire fight into a debate instead of an injustice. And suddenly, Shaq understood exactly why Bradley hadn't backed down. Because he wasn't the one pulling the strings. Shaq sat in his car, gripping his phone so tight his knuckles turned white. He had 2 choices. Let this play out. Let the media twist itself in circles, turning Lenny's truth into just another screaming match between talking heads. Or shut it down, loudly, publicly, permanently. There was only one real option. Shaq took a breath. Then, he made the next call. It was time to bring this to the people. It was time to go live. The stage was set. One of the biggest networks in the country, a primetime slot. A veteran journalist known for asking the hard questions. And at the center of it all, 3 seats, 3 men. One truth. Shaquille O'Neal, Lenny Carter, Calvin Roswell, the journalist who uncovered the buried military records. The world was watching. And this time, no one was controlling the narrative but them. The camera panned in. The host introduced the segment with carefully rehearsed neutrality. This story has sparked national debate. Was a veteran disrespected? Or is this another example of cancel culture going too far? Shaq almost laughed. They were still trying to make it a debate. Then the host turned to him. Shaquille, let's start with you. Why did you step in that day? Shaq looked directly into the camera. Because I saw something I've seen my whole life. A black man being disrespected, ignored, treated like less. He paused. I wasn't going to let it happen again. The host shifted. Some say this wasn't about race. Shaq's jaw tightened. Yeah? Then why does Bradley Whitaker have a team of political fixers covering for him? The host blinked. He wasn't expecting that. Shaq leaned forward. Y'all want to talk about what's too far. Let's talk about how an entire group of powerful people tried to erase a war hero because he was black. He turned to Lenny. Let's talk about how this man saved 6 soldiers and never got a single medal for it. The host turned to Lenny. Lenny, do you believe your race played a role in your military records being altered? Lenny, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. Lady, he said, voice steady. I don't have to believe it. I know it. The camera zoomed in. A lifetime of betrayal sat behind his eyes. The host hesitated. This wasn't going the way the network wanted. They had expected a discussion, a little back and forth, something to keep the ratings up. Instead, Shaq and Lenny were dismantling the entire game. The host turned to Calvin, the journalist. You uncovered these military records. Can you confirm what was found? Calvin didn't hesitate. Lenny Carter was the commanding officer on a classified mission in Vietnam. He led the team. He got 6 men out alive. And yet the official report credited a white officer instead. The host adjusted her earpiece. Someone in the control room was probably screaming. Calvin continued. Not only that, but military historians have since confirmed that this wasn't an isolated case. Black soldiers were frequently denied recognition, their achievements buried, their records altered. The tension in the studio was thick. The truth was too big to spin. The host cleared her throat, attempting to regain control. So, what happens now? Shaq leaned back. That's the real question, isn't it? The host turned to Lenny. What do you want to happen? Lenny exhaled. I want my name back. The studio fell silent. Shaq nodded. You heard the man, he said, voice firm. We're not stopping until it happens. And with that, the conversation shifted for good. The interview shattered the internet. For the first time, the headlines weren't about Bradley's lawsuit. They were about Lenny, the stolen medals, the erased history, the decades of injustice buried under bureaucracy. And now people wanted answers. The pressure was on. The U.S. military couldn't ignore it anymore. Neither could the government. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was a reckoning, and Shaq had made damn sure of it. By the end of the night, social media had turned its full attention to Lenny Carter. Hashtags flooded the internet. Chuck honor Lenny Carter. I give back. The medal. Our erase. The lies. And for the first time in his life, Lenny Carter's name was exactly where it always should have been. Right in the spotlight. Right in history. And this time, no one was going to bury it. The interview hit like a tidal wave. Within minutes of airing, the internet exploded. Clips flooded social media. News networks dissected every sentence, and commentators argued over what it all meant. But the loudest reaction? It came from the people. For years, Lenny Carter had been a footnote in history, a name buried in classified reports, a man who had been ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. But now his voice was everywhere. For the first time, the world heard his story. Every painful detail. He spoke about the mission, the men he had saved, the fear, the chaos, the impossible odds. He described how he had watched his brothers fall, knowing that if he didn't act, none of them were getting out alive. And then, he talked about the betrayal. How, when they returned home, he expected honor, recognition, the truth. Instead, silence. His name was erased from reports. A white officer took credit. The country he had risked his life for turned its back on him. And for decades, he just had to live with it. People watching at home were silent. And then, the floodgates opened. I'm literally crying right now. This man gave everything for his country, and they erased him. Imagine living your whole life knowing the truth and not being able to do anything about it. How many more Lenny Carters are out there? How many black soldiers had their stories stolen? But not everyone was moved. Some people doubled down. Where's the proof? Why bring this up now? Maybe he just wasn't as important as he thinks he was. This is just another attempt to rewrite history. The divide was sharp, but the truth had already been unleashed, and nothing was stopping what came next. For a brief moment, Bradley Whitaker was winning. His lawsuit against Whitaker's Market had turned him into a symbol for a certain kind of outrage. He was the guy who stood up against cancel culture. The networks called him a hard-working man who lost everything over a misunderstanding. But then, the emails leaked. Someone inside Whitaker's Market had seen enough. An anonymous employee forwarded a chain of internal emails to a reporter. The contents? Devastating. Emails from Bradley himself, instructing employees to profile black customers. If they don't look like they belong, assume they're stealing. We don't need certain types making customers uncomfortable. If corporate asks, deny everything. Within an hour, the story was everywhere. The same networks that had painted Bradley as a victim now scrambled to distance themselves. And his legal team? They dropped him. As soon as the emails hit the news, Whitaker's Market was done. Customers boycotted nationwide. Their stock plummeted. Corporate issued a panicked statement, throwing Bradley under the bus. We are shocked and appalled by these leaked communications. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind. We are conducting a full internal investigation. But no one bought it. Because the truth was out, and now it was too late. In the middle of it all, Shaq did something unexpected. He disappeared. No follow-up interviews. No press conferences. No victory laps. Because he never needed credit. He had done what he came to do. The truth was out. The world was watching. And now, it was time for them to decide what to do with it. As the sun set on another chaotic day, Lenny Carter sat on his porch, staring out at a world that finally knew his name. For the first time in decades, he wasn't invisible. And for the first time in his life, he dared to wonder if justice was actually coming. But deep down, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. The storm had passed. But the wreckage remained. For weeks, the headlines had been relentless. News cycles churned through every detail, every leaked email, every debate. And then, finally, something happened that no one thought would. Justice. It started with a single phone call. Lenny was sitting on his porch, watching the sun creep up over the rooftops, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something told him to. "This is General Tate," the voice said, firm, no nonsense. Lenny sat up straighter. "Sir, I wanted to tell you personally," General Tate continued. "Your records have been corrected." Lenny's chest tightened. He wasn't sure he'd heard right. Tate cleared his throat. "The Pentagon is issuing an official statement. You're being awarded the Silver Star." Silence. Not because Lenny didn't have anything to say, but because there was too much. Decades of waiting. Decades of knowing the truth but never being able to prove it. Now the world finally saw him. His name, his story, his legacy. Restored. Tate continued, voice steady. "There's going to be a ceremony in D.C. The president wants to be there." Lenny swallowed hard. He had never cared about medals. He had never fought for recognition. But this wasn't just for him anymore. This was for every man who had been erased before him. Finally, he exhaled. "All right, Lenny said. I'll be there. Days later, the U.S. government issued a formal statement. A high-ranking official stood behind a podium, cameras flashing, the nation watching. We deeply regret the misrepresentation of Captain Leonard Carter's service to this country. His bravery, leadership, and sacrifice were overlooked due to systemic failures of the time. That failure ends today. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And for Lenny, it was proof that the truth couldn't stay buried forever. While Lenny's story was finally being made right, Whitaker's market was falling apart. Corporate couldn't recover. Their stock had plummeted. Franchise owners were abandoning ship. And then, one morning, the announcement came. Whitaker's market was closing permanently. Their final statement was pathetic. Due to unforeseen business challenges, we are shutting down operations nationwide. They never mentioned Lenny. They never mentioned Bradley. But everyone knew exactly what had happened, and no one was sorry. As for Bradley, he was gone. No more interviews. No more lawsuits. He had vanished. Rumors swirled. Some said he had moved to another state, changed his name. Others said he was still fighting online, hiding behind anonymous accounts. But the truth? No one cared anymore. His moment had passed. And in the end, he was exactly what he had always been. Small. Lenny's story didn't just change his life, it changed the conversation. People started digging into other buried military records. Investigations were launched. Other black veterans came forward. Because Lenny Carter wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last, America had seen the truth. And this time, they couldn't look away. Far from the cameras, far from the noise, Shaquille O'Neal sat in a small cafe. He sipped his coffee, watching as a young mother struggled to pay for her meal. Shaq didn't say anything, didn't make a scene. He just quietly slipped a few bills to the cashier. No cameras, no headlines. Because he never did it for those. He did it because it was right. Injustice doesn't fade. It waits. Lenny Carter's story isn't just history. It's a reminder of how many voices still go unheard, how many truths still need uncovering. Next time you see something wrong, don't look away. Be the reason it gets set right. Because silence never changed the world. People did.